This is chapter 5 about populations, part 3, and we're looking at how the energy within a population and food chains, food webs, and things like that, and looking at a couple of terms: producer, and then this word autotroph. So producer and autotroph. Auto means self. The word troph means feeder. So producers are self feeders, is another way you can say it, and they make their own food. Uh, Producers, we studied photosynthesis, using sunlight, and chlorophyll is a pigment that traps the sunlight or the energy, and in the structures of the chloroplast. There are some bacteria that can make their own food through chemosynthesis, and they would also be considered producers. So any organism that can make their own food, autotrophs, they're called producers. Okay, so these two words are the same. We usually don't say plants, even though plants are producers and they're autotrophs. The reason that, the term plants is not necessarily used is because not all autotrophs are plants. Now, all plants are autotrophs, but not the reverse. And then we have consumers. Consumers are heterotrophic. Hetero means different, and trophic means feeder. So these are different feeders. They can't make their own food, so they have to get their food from other sources. So here we see a producer is going to be the algae here in this pond area, and then all the other things are producers, even the decomposers. The decomposers are consuming. They're not making their own food. They're consuming dead, decaying matter. We would call this, if this division, we've got the producers, and then the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers. So as we go up pyramids, a food chain would be if we had a single line, how energy was being passed: grass to the grasshopper. Grasshopper eats the grass, and then the garter snake eats the grasshopper, and then the hawk eats the garter snake. So this would be just a simple food chain if you have one thing. But this diagram and the one before was illustrating a food web. So food web is interconnected, and like there's several things that are eating the grasshopper, the toads and the spiders and the snakes and the mouse, lots of things eating the grasshopper. But this would be your producer. All of these would be your consumers. If we went producer, primary consumer, and then what eats, snake could eat it, but since there's not arrow there, I'll go primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. So primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. So as you go up through, I don't think primary is 1, secondary, it's 2, and tertiary means 3. So this is an energy pyramid. Energy pyramid is, so we measure energy in our food as calories. We'll look on the package to see how much calories or energy that we can get by eating that. Most of our the food that we consume, for most animals, 90% of it is lost as heat, which means just your metabolism, your cells functioning, the muscles contracting. So energy is needed to perform those functions. So just general metabolism. But only 10% goes from one level in the energy pyramid to the next. So on this base of the pyramid, you have a large amount of producers. So your producers are your autotrophs, huge amount down here. And then because of whatever energy is here, only 10% of it is transmitted to the next level. So let's say that you had 100% of the energy, let's say, that was produced by your plants. Let's say a plant. If I had, let's say, 100 calories, I'll do, because we'll make this math a little easy. Then if there were, if there were 100 calories of energy produced here, 90% of that would be consumed by the plant in order to carry on its functions of photosynthesis or metabolism. And that means that only 10% of it is stored and available for use in by the next consumer. So if you had 100 calories here, then in the next level, there would only be 10 calories present that can be utilized and used by these consumers. Now, those consumers would use 90% of that. And if they were eaten by a secondary consumer or a second level consumer, then only 1 calorie. So if I had 110 and only 1 calorie is available for use. So I just used the 100 just to make the math easy. But this might be 10,000 calories. Then you would reduce that to 1,000 and then to 100 and then to 10. So it just to note that in an energy pyramid, with each level that you change to, the energy consumed is 90%, but the energy transmitted to the next level is only 10%. When we look at our consumption in the world, the wealthiest portion of the world, let's say 20% of the world's population accounts for 86% of the consumption of resources and 53% of CO2 emissions. That's a big carbon footprint there. But if you took the poorest countries and 20% of that population in the poorest country, they're responsible for 1.3% of consuming what we call resources, which would be the things that we need to survive: food, water, space, and then only 3% of the CO2 emissions. And here goes the resource, back to the resource. What is a resource? You know, a resource is anything that your water, your nutrients, the light, the food, the space, anything that's necessary for life, that is a resource. Shelter, you know, all those things can be resources. So if we look at the USA, compared to and it says acres of land required to support an individual as standard population. So in the USA, we need a lot of resources compared to some of the other countries. So we consume a good bit. Competitive exclusion principle. This says, now, when you have two different species in the same niche or area, they're going to compete because they're competing for those resources. And so you can't have two at the same time. And that's where we get, and we looked at a graph that was very similar to this in the first part of this chapter, when I talked about wolves and the moose, the population. So I don't know if you remember what kind of growth this is called when you've got this up and down population of the rabbits or the snowshoe hares goes up, and then the population of the lynx goes up, and then the population, the lynx eat a bunch of the snowshoe hares and their population goes down. Well, then the lynx population will go down because there's not as much food and they start to compete. This is called logistic growth. So this logistic of one increasing then the other increase, and then you have then the resources get limited, and then that will cause a decrease of one, and then which in turn causes a decrease of the other. So it's a logical pattern of increase and decrease with those predators and preys. So when this, I talked to you a little bit when we were talking about the birds and the female birds. When resources are limited, the cost of reproduction is high, especially for the female, who may have to not only, she's going to need nutrients to make her healthy enough to produce offspring, but then also to nourish those offspring. That the reproduction cost to her is high to take and to care for the offspring. So whenever you have, if there's lots of available resources, then you may have lots of variety in the organisms, and the population may increase. Excuse me. But when resources are limited, there's a cost of reproduction, and there'll be selection that will favor individuals that are healthier. That goes back to that idea of the survival of the fittest. That's what this is saying, that individuals are going to be selected that can utilize resources efficiently and be successful at reproduction. Populations, you want to be below the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, once it reaches that, it will, death rate will increase, birth rate may increase, but a lot of it flatlines. So you're going to see that steady state accomplished whenever you get the carrying capacity. But if you're far below the carrying capacity, so if there's abundant resources, then reproduction cost is low. And so you're going to have even males that maybe in other cases, not the pinkest flamingos, those males may be successful at reproduction if there's an abundance of resources. The last thing this chapter I want to talk to you about is different species. Keystone species is when you have a specific population of organisms that impact an environment greatly. For example, the beavers in this. So an example of a keystone species would be the beaver. And you don't have to have a large number of them, but what they've done, if you remove them, then it would change and impact the community of plants and other organisms in that environment. So if we look at this, beavers sometimes will construct dams along fast-moving streams, and it will cause a ponding of water. There's fish and plants that can survive better in a ponded area than in a fast-moving stream. You're not going to see ducks and as much in a fast-moving stream as you will in a pond. Cattails. I don't know if you've ever seen cattails in a fast-moving stream, but you see them lots of times in ponds. So the impact of the population or the numbers of other animals and plants is impacted by that keystone species. If it's present, there's a certain variety of plants and animals, and if it's absent, that would change. Symbiosis. So if normally we would want to go to this word right here and think of biology and life, but osis right here, osis means process, and this is why I want you to key in the word bi, like bicycle. Bi means two. So two organisms live together. And here you've got a plant and an animal. So these are two organisms. The the flower needs a butterfly in order to pollinate. The flower is giving the butterfly something that it wants. It's giving it nectar, so that both of those do well because they both get what they need. So there's different kinds of symbiosis. One is like the butterfly and the lily there. That would be called mutualism if both organisms benefit. Here we've got these birds that a lot of times you find birds on grazing animals that will fly in and around and stay around grazing animals. And that's because, you know, a lot of times these animals, the smell and everything attracts a lot of insects. And so they're eating the insects. And so if they get a food source, a lot of times if they're, you know, this animal's bent down grazing, it may not be alerted visually to a predator. And so sometimes the birds can, by alerting them because they fly away, that would alert them that something may be around. But they're at an advantage too because these birds are eating the bugs off of them, and then the birds are benefiting because they're getting milk. Commensalism is when one species benefits and the other one is neutral. It's not help or harm. So one example is Spanish moss. Spanish moss is this stuff. It's an epiphyte. Epi means above. Phyte, this is a plant. So it grows on top of the soil. No, it doesn't need soil, but it doesn't need a really moist environment because it doesn't have roots. It extracts some moisture from the air. But it doesn't need to be in the water. So by hanging on the trees, the tree gives it support. The tree isn't hurt by the Spanish moss, but then the Spanish moss does have an advantage because it has that support that it gets from the tree. Another example, a good one of commensalism is the clownfish. So the clownfish is, remember Finding Nemo, the clownfish lives in the sea anemone. The anemone produces little stinging poison nematocytes that normally fish are repels fish, but the clownfish is immune to that. So this protects a clownfish because other larger fish or other animals, predators, won't come near the sea anemone, but it doesn't help or harm the sea anemone. So that's a commensalism. Sometimes the commensalism may change, like here, even the mutualism between the birds eating the bugs off of the grazing animal. If they sometimes pick scabs, or maybe, you know, they pick out a bug and cause an opening in the skin, any broken skin, that is a pathway to infection. So it could cause disease, possibly, or infection. So this would be when the relationship isn't good. It was good for the bird because it's getting food or maybe even drinking the blood, but then if it's going to cause infection or disease in the grazing animal, then that would be parasitism. So parasitism is when one benefits, like the tick, and the other is harmed. So parasites, you have worm parasites that will transmit disease to their host. A lot of times these parasites, they don't want to kill the host real quickly because, like with the tick, they want to drink a lot of blood. And so, but the disease or even infection may be slow, but it does cause harm to the host. This is just describing a flatworm, which is a parasitic worm, and it lives in an ant. And so the ant, it doesn't hurt the ant, but the ant will crawl up the blade of grass and is inadvertently eaten by the grazing animal, and then the flatworm develops after it's in the intestines of that animal, grazing animal. The last part is about ecological succession. Succession means a process of steps. So this is gradual regrowth. When you have, I've always described, if you have a plowed field, maybe in your garden, you've got a garden that your mom or grandmother has always grown things, and maybe they don't grow something for a year. What's going to grow there? Well, weeds and stuff. What if they don't plant a garden for 3 or 4 years? Then you may have some small little pine trees and larger things that will grow. And then if it remains unplanted or plowed or work for 10 years or so, you may get even larger trees. And then 50 years or so, you may get these hardwoods. So this is a succession or a series of steps, a progression of how the land and the environment changes over time. So initially, you're going to have, if you've got these low growing weeds and grasses and plants, you're going to have certain animals that will live there that can be supported by that kind of food source and resources. Once you get little small shrubs and stuff, you may even get more animals, a little different from just this. And then as it gets old, you've got maybe more nesting birds here. So the development of not only the land and the plants change, but also the animal populations and things change over time. So that's what ecological succession is. You've got 2 types of ecological succession. Primary means first. So let's say we just had to start with nothing. We started with rock. An example of this would be if you had a volcano erupted and then you have the lava and then it hardens, you're going to have solid rock. Before that would ever grow anything, you've got to have water and erosion that's going to break that lava into small particles enough to be, to make soil. And then, so primary means first, has never supported life, or all that life was destroyed. Secondary succession means you're not really starting from ground zero, like rock. You do have soil that's present. So a good example of this would be either flooding or forest fire, where it burns all the plants and even the animals may leave that area. And so you start with maybe this, you still have soil. So within the soil, you also have what's called a seed bank. Even in a forest fire, many times the seeds will survive because they're down in the ground. So secondary succession is when you get a regrowth after it's been, disrupted. And even if all these animals that once lived here are gone, eventually over this ecological succession, the animals may return, but it will take a while. Pioneer species is, like I said before, there's a seed bank in the soil. So seeds that are already present in the soil, those will seed and regrow quickly. Most of those are your native species. So when you have a disruption, the first things that grow back after that is called a pioneer species. So they're going to be the predominant species. And again, typically it's because, you've got a lot of seeds in the soil already present. Once you get through those stages of regrowth, ecological succession, the last stage is called a climax community. The climax community is where you see very little change, and it's an end point. You see very little change in the plants or the animals. Like if you went back to this, the redwood forest, pretty much looks the same if you went there. People that went there 50 years ago and 50 years from now, unless something catastrophic happens, it's going to look the same. Unlike this is if you were here, this is not a climax community because, within 5 or 10 years, this is not going to look the same. It's going to look different. So climax community is this endpoint where you get, these are going to be your native, mostly your native vegetation, and also native animals that typically exist in that area and can survive and reproduce well in that area with those temperatures and things. And that's the end of chapter 5. And if you haven't practiced on your with your resources, your on Jolleyology, your rags to riches, you need to do that. Look over your notes, take your exam 5 test. Make sure that you look at the videos within the PowerPoint, click on those, watch those. Those are really short. And then there are some video questions for you to do on those. And good luck with your exam.